told my mom I was depressed, and she sent me to her old therapist, who turned out to be the same man she had an affair with while still married to my dad, and the sessions slowly started tearing apart everything I believed about my childhood. The very first time I tried to tell my mom that I was depressed, it didn't quite go well. I'd had this weight of thick fog inside me for so long, like I was moving while the world moved around me and I was stuck in place watching. One evening at dinner, I just couldn't help it anymore, and I told her, trying to sound casual but trembling on the inside. I said, "Mom, I think I'm seriously depressed." She looked up, not much to say, and then said she knew a guy who could help. She told me about her old therapist from years back, this guy she'd gone to when I was young. I didn't want to say no or argue. I was so ready to do anything that would make the fog lift. So, I started going to his office. The first visit was odd. The waiting room smelled of that old doctor kind of antiseptic, but in some way like an ancient library. I finally caught sight of him, and I sensed how familiar he was, but pushed it out of my mind. He was reserved, older, and had a soft voice that tried to reassure. I braced myself for the usual questions and maybe some scribbles, but he asked little at first. Instead, he simply let me talk, which was terrifying and reassuring too, because I'd never expressed just how awful it was inside. But through a few sessions, small things crept in that felt strange. He'd make a comment about growing up, about how my parents weren't as great as I believed. I'd brush it off initially, like, no, they loved me, they did. But he'd just keep on referring to things I hadn't thought about, such as when my mom was out of the country, or when my dad was angry but I didn't know why. It was as if he was dismantling this whole foundation I had in my mind about what my family was. One day, when I was leaving a session, I called my mother, just to chat and let her know what was happening with how weird the therapy was getting. She sounded odd, as if she were hiding something from me. Curious, I probed her again, and she got quiet and said, "It's complicated, honey. Some things are better left in the past." That sounded like a warning, but I was so committed to the therapy that I didn't end it. And then I was walking through my mother's house one afternoon, and I was rummaging through a box of her belongings, and I came across an old photograph of she and the therapist smiling at each other close, like more than doctor and patient. I felt this cold feeling like a jolt ran through me. I did not want to believe it, but the session suddenly made sense in a frightening way. The partner that was trying to untangle my childhood was the same one my mother had an affair with when she was still married to my dad. I didn't know what to do with this. I felt the ground I had walked on crack open. All the stories relayed by the therapist about my family now sounded as if they had an ulterior motive. I was looking at my childhood through a new, shattered prism. The individual who was going to help me heal was tied up in a betrayal, something I had no idea about until this point. It was tough going back to therapy afterwards. Part of me just wanted to run from it, but the other part was screaming to keep peeling it away, regardless of the hurt. I started to notice the little ways that the therapist pushed me, like trying to figure out how much I really did accept what I'd been told about my parents. Now that I understand, I realize he wasn't just trying to help me with depression. He was pushing all of my assumptions about my family and my memories. One night, after one particularly difficult session, I was alone in my room, and I cried for the first time in months. I was dazed and angry. How could my mom have kept that secret from me? How could I ever trust her or anyone else again? And how much of the person I thought I was, based on a lie? The therapist had thrown open a window into a past I was not prepared to confront, yet I was stuck on the other side. The sessions were beginning to affect my mental health rather than benefit. I was losing bits of myself with each session. I couldn't help but ask myself if the man I was talking to saw me as just another part of his past, one piece of a puzzle in a story that didn't exactly belong to me. I struggled to keep my balance between wanting to heal and wanting to protect what was remaining of my childhood innocence. And the worst of it was that I came to understand that my mom had left me with someone who had betrayed my family in a manner I was only now coming to understand. It was like my trust had been double-crossed twice, initially by all the things being withheld from me, and then by the therapy that was supposed to fix me but was breaking me apart. I did not reveal it to anybody else. It was too raw, too painful to release. I returned again and again because I kept thinking that perhaps, some way, if I just kept digging up the past, I'd get answers that would make it clear. But the only things I found were questions, and doubts, and increasingly a disintegrating image of my childhood. Looking back now, I can see how those months changed everything I thought I knew about my family and me. I learned that healing isn't always a straight line. It's complicated and confusing and full of times when you wish you could just throw in the towel. But even amid all of that dysfunction, I started to understand that some things aren't about fixing or erasing. Sometimes, it's just about facing the truth, no matter how painful it is. That was part 1 of my story. There are 3 parts left where it all comes apart even more, and I try to rebuild myself out of what's left. After that shock with the photo, I hoped I could just cut out of therapy, or at least tell my mom what I'd learned and get some kind of explanation. But when I tried to bring it up, things were awkward. She changed the subject or brushed it aside as if it was something dangerous, something I wasn't supposed to know. That silence between us grew heavier day by day. I felt I was drowning in questions without answers. Therapy sessions weren't any easier either. The fellow my mom's old therapist started examining more deeply. He'd ask me questions about my parents in a way that made me uncomfortable. Like, why was my dad distant at times? What kind of marriage did they really have? He'd speak of things I hadn't even thought about myself. It was as if he was leading me down this dark hall of memories I couldn't look away from. But I was too scared to turn around, too, because part of me still wanted him to help me sort some things out. One time, he said something that stuck with me. He told me, sometimes the people you love most aren't always the ones that keep you safest. I didn't want to believe so. Not about my mom, not about my dad. But those words echoed in my head for days. It led me to question how much of my childhood was actually real and how much I had manufactured as a story to safeguard myself. I started noticing things: minor late-night calls from when I was a child, mom, dad's huffy muteness, the way my mom didn't even look at me sometimes. I had always thought they were just stress or work material. But now I was catching a glimpse of something dark, something I wasn't meant to know. The therapist knew just what to push on, even when I was attempting to keep everything on the surface level. And then there were the other times too, when he would almost collapse, as if his cool mask was cracked for a second, and I would see something else, maybe guilt, remorse, or maybe something else. I was bewildered and disturbed. I couldn't help but wonder if he was sorry about what went on with my mom, or if he just didn't care either. It was hard to tell. The hardest was when the therapist started asking me questions about my memories directly. Are you really sure of that second? Could it have been different? He asked once. I tensed up. I did not know how to answer because parts of the memories had seemed so solid, but other parts now seemed to shift, as if I was again losing the ground under my feet. It was like I was rerouting, but in a terrible way. One evening, I told him this one summer evening I remember my parents having this enormous fight, the kind of fight where you wish you would just disappear from the world. I said I thought it was just typical married couple, but he said that fight didn't sound like that. It sounded like betrayal. My chest cramped. I didn't want to accept it. But how could I not when my whole world was crumbling down? I walked out of that session with the feeling of holding a burden I couldn't set down. The man who was supposed to assist me was questioning everything I believed about my family. The memories I'd kept close for comfort now color-dusted with pain and uncertainty. And I knew that the childhood I'd remembered, the one with family dinners, hugs, and security, may have been more precarious than I'd ever given myself reason to think about. I thought about stopping therapy, but I was scared of what would happen if I did. The depression didn't simply stop once I'd learned these secrets. If anything, things worsened. I felt like I had opened a door in my mind that could not be closed. I kept going back because I needed answers, but every answer was a chink in the structure of who I was. One night after a session, I sat in my car, parked outside my apartment, just staring at the dashboard. My hands trembled, and I couldn't help but question how much my life had changed within a span of mere hours. I felt alone, literally alone. As if the individuals who were meant to be around me had left me to figure this out for myself. I thought about calling my dad. Maybe he would be able to tell me what really happened with my mom and the therapist. But I didn't know if I wanted to hear his side, if hearing it would only make it hurt more. I was at this in-between space, caught between wanting the truth and needing to be returned to where I was before I ever knew it. Weeks became days, and therapy less and less became about a solution for my depression and more about sorting out the history of my family. It was exhausting. I'd emerged from the sessions feeling as if I'd weathered a storm, my heart pounding, my mind spinning. But I kept returning, even though every part of my body screamed at me to leave. I started writing, recording all that I could remember, each bout, each silence, each pasted-on smile. Writing was preferable. It tidied up the maelstrom in my head a bit. But it also made me see how much I didn't know, how much was missing or broken. The more I learned, the more I realized that my mom's past wasn't simple. There were things she'd hidden for years, things she hadn't told me or my dad, and the therapist was one of those secrets, entangled in a past that kept spilling over into my future. I began to understand that healing wasn't all about me anymore. It was about confronting a whole web of pain and deception that traced way back decades. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if my mom did actually send me to this therapist on purpose. Like maybe she needed somebody to sort through the past without letting me in on the whole truth. Maybe she didn't believe I was ready, or maybe she was shielding herself. I don't know. What I do know is that the more the therapist questioned, the more the cracks widened in my family story, until it felt like all of it was about to shatter. But through all that hopelessness, I started to discover something fragile but real. I realized that I did not need to believe everything that was told to me, and I didn't need to bear the shame of my parents' defeat. I could start building my own story, one piece at a time, however ugly and hurting it was. That's where I was when part 2 stopped hanging in between past and future, still struggling to find a way to heal without getting lost. The therapy sessions with the counselor were not over yet, and neither was the peeling away of my childhood. I just kept returning to that counselor even though every session was a minefield walk. I think some part of me was addicted to the pain, like if I ever stopped, all that questioned and doubted me would consume me. But the longer he talked, the more I realized this wasn't just therapy but untangling an entire mess my mom and I had been living in without knowing. He posed me a question one day that I wasn't expecting. He said, "Have you ever stopped to think about how your mother's choices might have affected you? Not the good things, but the things she kept from you?" I blinked, unsure of what to say. I wished to be a good child and provide for my mom, but I wished to know why she'd let me go with this man, the one she'd been with previously, the one who'd been with her for all the worst times. That's the question that lingered within my mind for days. I started recalling things differently, little things with my mom that now seemed like they were buried with a secret. The way she would occasionally look at me with sad eyes, or the way she would disappear for hours on end without letting me know where she was going. I imagined those were just adult problems, but maybe they were connected with something else, something related to her affair and the therapist. I realized that my mother's story was a story of regret and suffering, but I had never really known that part of her myself. All I knew was the woman who prepared dinner, helped with homework, and tucked me in at night. There was a different story that existed beneath that one she had kept hidden, a story that was collapsing due to the therapy. The more the therapist pulled on these threads, the more I felt like I was losing the mother I believed I had. It killed me. I couldn't help but wonder how much suffering she'd had and how much of that affliction somehow fell upon me without my ever knowing. It felt like my childhood was a house constructed on secrets, and now the walls were rubble. I sat on my bed floor one night, after a session that had left me raw and exhausted, and just let myself cry. The kind of cry where it all spills open, the anger, the sadness, the confusion. I thought about my dad too, how betrayed he would have been likely to feel, and how maybe I was also carrying shards of that pain. I knew I wasn't just fighting my own depression anymore. I was fighting the ghosts of my family's past. I started noticing how my outside of therapy relationships were shifting too. I was more standoffish with friends, more protective. I was pulling away, like I didn't want to let anyone get close in case they found out all the nastiness inside me. It was lonely. I missed the feeling of security and belonging that went with being loved without all these questions looming above me. But simultaneously, there was a chilling transparency in the hurt. I started to understand my narrative wasn't about what had occurred to me but about how I reacted to it. For all his shortcomings, the therapist was pushing me to examine some of myself that I'd been dodging for far too long. I was finding that recovery wasn't a case of forgetting what had occurred in the past and pushing it aside. It was facing the truth, even though it hurt, and learning to cope with it. One day I simply asked the therapist point blank, "Why did you get involved with my mom? What was going on then?" He paused, then explained in a whisper that it was a confusing time for both of them, that things went wrong, and that he wasn't particularly proud of it. Listening to him say it was like stripping away another layer of history, and it reminded me of just how human all the people involved were, imperfect, broken, doing their best to make things work. That admission didn't fix everything, but it helped me to see that the story wasn't so black and white after all. There were no clean solutions or neat endings, just people making choices, some good, some terrible, and the consequences that followed. It was sordid, ugly, and real. As the sessions went on, I started trying to get myself straight on what I wanted out of all of this. I didn't want to be stuck in the past for all eternity. I wanted to have some sort of peace, even if it was a flawed peace. I wanted to get to know my mom, not judge her. And maybe most importantly, I wanted to forgive myself for being lost and broken. There were still days the depression was strong and the memories engulfed me, but I arrived to hold on to a small hope that maybe, by facing what was, I could start to build anew, something real and true, something that wasn't based on secrets or silence. In looking back, I can see that those months of therapy were some of the hardest and most important of my life. They tore me apart, but they also gave me a chance to put myself back together, not as a perfect family or a perfect individual, but as one who had survived the storm and was learning to live with the wounds. I don't know all the answers today, and maybe I never will, but I know that I don't have to be at the mercy of the past. And that is something I have been trying to hold on to day by day. The last sessions with that counselor were the toughest. By then, I was not just struggling with depression but grappling with a maelstrom of emotions I had not expected: anger, betrayal, loss, and confusion. I remember sitting there one day, feeling exposed as if I had lost all my clothes, and for a moment I wished I had not set out on this path. I was like I was standing on the rim of a cliff, my past behind me falling away, and no firm ground in front of me. Eventually, I stopped trying to hide how much this was hurting. I told them that I felt like all the things I had thought about my childhood were crumbling, that I didn't know who my parents really were, or even who I was anymore. He heard in silence and continued, "Sometimes the hardest thing is letting go of what we thought was real, so we have space for what is." That line hit me more than anything else. I knew I needed to heal was to accept the complexity of the past, and not to dream that it never happened. I also understood that the work of the therapist was not to dig up the past but to help me figure out how to live with it. It wasn't about the eradication of pain but how to bear it in another way. That took a while and was agonizing. There were moments when I was okay, when it seemed I was making progress, and moments when the suffocating burden came back, when I couldn't breathe. Talking about my mom and the affair was like walking on broken glass. I needed to know but needed to shield her too. I kept reminding myself that she was human, too, a sinner who had made mistakes, regretted what she did, and probably carried her own kind of pain all these years. It was complex. Loving her didn't mean that I was ignoring what happened, but it didn't mean that I hated her either. One night, I spent an evening flipping through old family photos one night following a difficult session. I caught glimpses of the smiles, the birthday, holiday memories that were so everyday but now were fragile. I realized that even with my childhood shattered by betrayals and lies, it was still mine, and maybe that was enough. I started setting boundaries in therapy. I told the therapist that I needed to move slower, that some things were too new to work through everything at once. He agreed, and we went in a different direction slightly, speaking more about how to manage the coping tools and depression that was still lingering. Those were quiet sessions, less dramatic, but more repairing. It was like learning how to tape over the cracks instead of just standing back and allowing them to widen. I also began to share with a couple of very close friends what I was going through. That was scary, letting people glimpse the shattered fragments of me, but it paid off. Talking to people who didn't have any idea what my family background was allowed me to just be me, freed from all those hidden histories. It reminded me I wasn't alone, even when I felt so in there. The last session with that therapist was like slamming shut a book I wasn't sure I was ready to close. We didn't resolve everything. There wasn't some exhilarating finale or neat wrap-up, but I felt something important, quiet strength, a sense that I could go on even if the past was messy and painful. I thanked him, and I felt much lighter after leaving his office. I've gradually been building my life since then. It's not perfect, some days are terrible, but I'm learning to live with the scars instead of allowing the scars build me. I've begun creating new memories, establishing connections that feel real and secure, and maintaining the hope that my story isn't one of merely what was lost but of what I can yet craft. If I look back now, I know that revealing my depression to my mom was the start of a journey I didn't know was waiting for me. It brought me to truths that ran deep, to confrontations with my history that I wasn't ready for, and to a confrontation with who I am and where I've come from. It also taught me something powerful, that healing is slow and ugly, and sometimes it involves taking down before you can build up. The hardest thing I learned was that people that we love are not always perfect, and sometimes they bring their own hurt and imperfections in a way we don't understand. Despite all of that, though, love can be present. It's imperfect and messy, but it is real, and sometimes that is enough to keep us going. That is the conclusion of my story for the time being. I'm still recovering, still discovering, still trying to find my place in a family that's messier than I could have possibly imagined. But I am here, I am standing, and that is something that feels worth holding on to.